Before I tell you how my WA threatened to fine me for my boat and how I revealed I actually own the entire lake they use for their weekend barbecues, make sure you stick around till the end because you won't believe how fast the smug smiles fell off their faces. And if you enjoy stories where arrogance meets its match, hit that subscribe button because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Now let's get into it. It all started on a bright Saturday morning when I was sipping my coffee on the deck of my lakefront cabin, staring out at the peaceful waters, thinking about how good life had been since I decided to leave the chaos of the city and buy a place where the air was cleaner, the nights were quieter, and the only noise I had to worry about was the occasional splash of a fish jumping out of the lake. And for years it had been just that, peaceful, calm, simple. But of course, peace doesn't last forever, especially when there's an HOA involved, and believe me when I say this one was the most overbearing, power-hungry, petty group of self-important busybodies you could ever imagine, the type of people who treat rulebooks like scripture and see themselves as divine enforcers of suburban order. So it wasn't long before their eyes landed on me and specifically, my boat, a modest but well-kept bass fishing boat that I kept tied neatly to the dock I'd built with my own hands. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just practical, but apparently to the WA board, it was some kind of affront to their sacred guidelines. And it all began with a neatly typed letter slipped into my mailbox, printed on official WA letterhead with a smugly phrased opening that read, "Dear resident, it has come to our attention that your vessel does not comply with community guidelines regarding watercraft aesthetics and storage. Please remove or relocate said vessel within 7 days or fines will be imposed." And I actually laughed when I read it because at first I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely they couldn't be talking about my little boat. After all, I'd seen much larger, gaudier pontoon boats floating out there every weekend, complete with beer coolers, stereos blasting bad country music, and half the neighborhood crowding onto them like they were hosting a frat party on water. But no, a quick follow-up email from the WA president herself, a woman named Cheryl who had the kind of personality that could curdle milk just by walking into a room, confirmed that yes, they were talking about my boat, claiming it was visually disruptive to the uniform character of the lakeside community. Which was ironic because this same Cheryl's husband had a pontoon boat painted neon green with flames stenciled on the side, but apparently that was grandfathered in, under some obscure clause they liked to invoke when rules inconvenienced them but needed to be weaponized against others. So I decided to play along at first, writing back a polite but firm email asking them to cite the exact section of the guidelines that prohibited my boat, and of course they responded not with specifics but with vague statements about community harmony and standards, basically dancing around the fact that there was no actual rule against my boat at all, but their arrogance fueled them to push harder, sending me final warnings, and even threatening daily fines of $50 if I didn't comply. And that's when I realized they had no idea who they were messing with, because here's the twist. While they controlled the WA, I controlled the lake, literally, as in when I bought this property years ago, I didn't just buy the cabin and the land it sat on. I bought the deed to the entire lake itself, a quirky but very real detail buried in the county's land records, meaning that while they governed the houses, the lawns, the fences, and the trash bins, the water they so loved to host barbecues beside, the water they launched their pontoons into, the water where their kids swam every summer, that was mine, all of it, and they either didn't know or had forgotten, because I never flaunted it, never had to. I was content to fish, boat, and enjoy the serenity without reminding people, but now they had forced my hand, so I decided to teach them a lesson in humility, and oh, was it sweet. The next WA meeting rolled around in their fancy little clubhouse, and I showed up with a folder full of documents, copies of the original deed, tax records, and even correspondence from the county confirming my ownership of the entire lake. And when they smugly brought up old business, and started listing me as a violator of community harmony, I waited until Cheryl puffed up her chest and said, "We must insist you remove that unsightly vessel immediately or face fines," before I calmly slid the papers across the table and said, "Actually, Cheryl, I think you'll want to read this first." And watching the color drain from her face as she scanned the deed was more satisfying than you could possibly imagine, and of course she tried to bluster, saying things like, "Well, this doesn't change the WA guidelines," to which I responded, "It changes everything, because the guidelines stop at the water's edge, and guess who owns the water?" And then I let it hang in the silence as the rest of the board members leaned in, their eyes widening as they realized what it meant, that their barbecues by the lake, their dock parties, their swimming, their pontoon joyrides, all of it was at my discretion, and I could revoke it any time I pleased, and that's when the room turned, because the very same neighbors who moments ago nodded along with Cheryl's little power trip were suddenly looking at her like she had just steered them straight into a brick wall, one of them even whispering, "Wait, if he owns the lake, does that mean?" And I cut in, "Yes, it means technically every time you've launched your pontoon boat, you've been using my property, every splash, every cannonball, every fishing line dropped in. It all happens on my land, and if I wanted to, I could ban every single one of you tomorrow." And the room went dead silent, the smug board suddenly reduced to squirming children caught with their hands in the cookie jar, and for once, Cheryl had no comeback, no policy clause to hide behind, nothing but the stark reality that her power meant nothing compared to mine. Now you'd think that would be the end of it, but oh no, the story gets juicier, because once word spread around the neighborhood that I owned the lake, everything changed. Suddenly the same people who used to glare at me for leaving my boat tied up at the dock were bringing over pies, inviting me to barbecues, asking if I needed help with anything, as if I hadn't been the outsider they wanted to push around just a week earlier. And it was hilarious to watch the transformation, but I wasn't about to let them off the hook that easily, so I drafted a new lake access agreement, a simple document that laid out terms for using the water. Nothing outrageous, just basic respect. No excessive trash, no neon pontoon parties blasting music at midnight, no threatening letters about unsightly vessels, and if they violated those terms, access could be revoked, and you better believe every single household signed that agreement faster than you can say, checkmate, because suddenly their summer fun depended on my goodwill, and oh, the sweet irony of it all, that the boat they tried to ban became the very symbol of my authority, tied up at my dock in plain view every time they launched their toys into my lake, a constant reminder of how badly they had misplayed their hand. But the best part came later, months down the line, when Cheryl herself, still HOA president but with far less bark than before, came knocking at my door with the most forced smile I'd ever seen, holding a basket of muffins and saying, "We just wanted to thank you for being such a cooperative neighbor." And I took the basket, smiled back, and replied, "No problem, Cheryl, I just want what's best for the community," knowing full well she had to grit her teeth every time she saw me sitting on my deck, sipping coffee, watching the sunrise over the lake that she once thought she controlled but now knew belonged entirely to me, and every time I untied my boat and cruised out across the water, I could feel the weight of poetic justice carrying me like the wind, a reminder that sometimes the universe delivers the sweetest victories not by avoiding conflict, but by letting arrogance walk straight into a trap of its own making. And that's how my wall learned the hard way that you don't pick fights with the guy who owns the entire lake you depend on. You don't try to bully someone without knowing exactly what kind of cards they're holding, and you certainly don't threaten to fine a man for his boat when that very boat is floating on waters that belong to him and him alone. And to this day, every time a neighbor waves from their pontoon, every time kids splash in the shallows, every time Cheryl forces a tight smile as she pedals past my dock, I remember that first smug letter they sent me and think to myself, checkmate, HOA, checkmate.